Hey everybody, welcome back. So in the previous episode I just finished milling up all of these boards, getting them ready to turn into the panels for the lower cabinet sections. And we decided what we're going to be doing with the spalted pieces, so having the two spalted door fronts and two visible sides of each cabinet. So I just have to get them glued up. I'll try and whiz through this nice and quickly for you, and then we need to start cutting them up to their final dimensions, putting the mitres on them, and then getting the two main cases glued up. So you may have just noticed that I have staggered these boards when doing the glue up. I don't usually do that, but in this case, because I'm trying to get the best continual line of that spalting down in between two panels, I've decided to offset them slightly. I can do this because whenever I'm milling up my timber in the rough stages, I'm always cutting everything oversized to give me a chance to then cut them down in the best orientation that I see fit. So either that's finding the nicest grain, or in this case making sure that the spalting lines up. If I've cut down a middle panel, or cut a panel down the middle to get it through my jointer in the first place. So that there is a good example. I'm just joining them up. Those ones aren't offset, but they luckily lined up quite well. The one thing I will note is that you do need to take note of where you've placed or cut your dominoes, as because this is quite oversized, I'm going to be cutting a bit off each end and each side to give me my final dimension. And if I didn't know where I'd cut my dominoes and I go to cut them down to final size later, I might cut through the middle of one of my dominoes. This isn't a huge issue if you're going to be joining on the ends, but if it's a visible end of a board and you've got a domino cut right through the middle, you're going to see that and it's not going to look very good. So that's all the glue ups for the bottom boxes done. I've got 8 side pieces and 2 fronts. I still need to glue up a backing, but I'll do that after I give all of these a quick sand up so they're ready to cut to final dimensions. So I'll just whiz through that quickly, and in a few seconds I will be ready to start cutting them up. Now that I've cut them down to their final width or depth, depending on how you look at it, on the table saw, I need to cut one of the ends perfectly square to give it a reference for the fence on the table saw to cut my mitres on. I don't really have any other way to do this other than with a track saw because they're so wide. I can't use the mitre saw, and I don't have a sliding panel saw, which would be the perfect tool for this, but I don't have one and my shop's definitely not big enough for one. So to cut these, I'm really carefully marking a square line off a edge that I left perfectly flat from the jointer. I'm coming in, marking that with the square, and then cutting it with the track saw. In this case, I got it ever so slightly off, so I went back in and cut another tiny little slither just to make sure it was perfect. The reason this is important is if I then move on to the next step of cutting the mitres on the table saw, and I didn't have a perfectly square edge, I'm not going to end up with a square box, and it's going to end up throwing everything off and making my life difficult later on. So I'm just taking my time and being super careful and making sure to thoroughly check after each cut, and if I need to go back and change it, I will, because everything's still oversized at this point. I'm giving myself the ability to do that. Now, this is relatively considered a sketchy operation. You shouldn't be using a table saw to cut something that's wider than it is long, because you run the risk of it twisting against the fence and the blade and potentially binding and causing kickback. I feel comfortable doing this, but I wouldn't recommend it for people that aren't really comfortable on a table saw. As you'll see in a couple of cuts, I actually have that happen. Luckily for me, it wasn't dangerous and it didn't cause a big kickback or anything, but it just emphasizes the point that if you can avoid this, I would suggest it. So the next 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 cuts ended up actually just going perfectly, up until this one where I started coming through, and looking back at it, it looks as though there's a slight cup in the board and it's just caught on the front edge of my outfeed table. To get past that, I decided to give it a little bump. And that was clearly the wrong move. As you can see, it's pushed away from the far side of my fence, causing it to bind against the blade. Now, like I said, that can be incredibly dangerous, and I was very lucky that it didn't end up any worse than it did. All I ended up with was a slight deviation on my line. Lucky for me, I've cut everything oversized, so I can go back and recut that bevel there, and then when I go to cut it to final size on the other side, it won't make any difference. For the final side on each of these, I just need to make sure all my measurements are bang on, as if I were to screw this up like I did on that last cut, I won't be able to come back in and take them down any shorter. Well, I would, but I really don't want to, as it'll change the measurements of everything else. So I've got to be really careful this time to stick to that fence and make sure nothing deviates. Alrighty-ro, so I've got my tops, bottoms and sides all done for the two boxes. In the next episode I'll get started on the backs and the little pull-out section for them.